Welcome everyone to What's Happening, a weekly podcast bringing you Bitcoin mining and mining-related content. I'm your host, Cassie Clifton, and thanks for joining me today. Before we dive into today's episode, I'm going to quickly plug the upcoming Bitcoin 2020 event in San Francisco, March 27th and 28th. Right now, it's positioned to be the largest Bitcoin event in the world. Almost 1,000 tickets have already been sold, and there's an anticipated 4,000 Bitcoiners convening in SF for this event. I can't speak highly enough about last year's event. In addition to some really high-quality speakers like Edward Snowden, there was also a ton to do outside of just listening to sessions, like an all-day rooftop beer garden and arcade, and numerous satellite events. So if you're not already going, I really suggest that you add this one to your event list. If you haven't bought a ticket yet, you can use my discount code for 20% off at checkout. It's CASS20, that's all caps, CASS20. And you can learn more about Bitcoin 2020 by clicking the link in the episode description. Today I have with me Chris Bendiksen, who is the head of research at CoinShares. Chris publishes a biannual report on Bitcoin mining, covering things like the trends in mining industry, average creation costs, electricity consumption, and energy sources. The most recent report was actually published just recently. I believe it was like December 9th. I highly encourage you to give it a read. I'm sure you've seen some of the miscellaneous op-eds titled something along the lines of Bitcoin predicted to be the nail in the coffin of climate change, or Bitcoin will burn the planet down. Chris has actually been one of the pioneers in helping to dispel a lot of those misconceptions surrounding Bitcoin's energy use. We briefly touched on this today. We also dive into some other interesting findings in his most recent report, like the 90% increase in hash rate over the last 6 months, 70% of which was in China, miner capitulation, differentiating all-in ROI break-even from cash flow break-even level, and what those mean for miners, as well as efficiencies and innovation in hardware. We also get into some fun topics like grid balancing as a use case for old mining hardware, the influence of misconceptions on Bitcoin mining on regulatory decisions, alternative financing methods for projects, and the difficulties of bringing debt into the space, the impact of depreciation schedules on the sustainability of mining operations, and the incentives for manufacturing operations to exist in North America. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and let's go ahead and get into it. Well, Chris, thanks so much for joining me today. I just wanted to say thank you to you and all of your colleagues at CoinShares for all of the work you do. I first saw your work, I believe it was at the Fidelity Mining Summit in Boston, but that was kind of like the first exposure I had to like major research publication in this space. I was really excited to see everything that you've been doing, especially around energy consumption. I know there's tons of misconceptions in that area. So we're really fortunate to have such a talented team of researchers publicly making this information available. Before we dive into the most recent report that you released last week, I'd love to learn a little bit more about like your background and how you found CoinShares, kind of, and then like what got you in the space.
My educational background is in the biosciences. I'm a biochemist and a biophysicist by training, but I've never really worked in that space. As soon as I got out of school, I went straight into finance here in London. And that's actually right around the time that I got introduced to Bitcoin. It was in 2013. I had a friend who was just absolutely crazy about it and wouldn't stop talking about it, even though I repeatedly told him this was the worst idea he'd ever shown me.
We all have those friends, yeah.
Yeah, I know.
We're not thankful for them, but...
Yeah, exactly. Hindsight, I'm like, man, another one of...
I made a career out of that, dude.
Seriously. And I mean, this guy has spectacular foresight. I just got to admit it. But, I guess it's one of those things where, most ideas are crap, but if you have enough of them, some of them are just going to be absolute gold. So, just got to be appreciative for being a person that this type of stuff is shared with,
Absolutely. My CEO actually got into the space because he heard about it. He thought that it was such a dumb idea, and then he kept trying to find ways to prove that it wouldn't work. And when he eventually couldn't find a way to be this is why it's not going to work, he was like, oh shit, I really have something here. This is really cool. I'm super pumped about this. And just completely 180 on his opinions there.
That's awesome. I mean, it makes sense, right? Especially right. if you're of those types who are, slightly obsessive or, perfectionist of leaning, and you just want to go in and show it to these people, and it actually just cannot be dismissed. pretty epic, pretty epic technology, I gotta say. I mean,
Yeah.
when I first heard about it, we almost did an office sweepstakes just as a
Really?
gambling thing. Yeah, um, the spring bull run of 2013. It went from like, I want to say like 30 to 260, except that it happened in like 3 days and then it dropped down to, 80 or something 2 days after. So we totally missed it based on timing. We we were going to set up like a Mt. Gox account. We are going to wire money to some shady overseas bank.
Where was that you were working then?
It was at a finance boutique here in
Okay.
London.
What were
So,
you doing for them?
analysis. I was just,
Okay, gotcha.
entry level analyst, building presentations and, doing all the grunt work.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Was that post? Did you have an MBA?
No.
Okay, gotcha.
No. I got
was
an
curious because
MSc.
I know oftentimes like a lot of like hard sciences will be hired into like finance or like management consulting firms. But I was just curious if like you went for the MBA first and went over there. But
No, I didn't. I thought about it. I mean, I still think about it, but
yeah, I understand that. But it's also like the opportunity cost of like shelling out that kind of money in this time in Bitcoin right now to go back to school just doesn't seem, at least
absolutely.
in my opinion, like it's the best time to capitalize on the opportunity. So
I know it. Just the opportunity cost of not being able or having to substitute the reading that I'm constantly doing in the Bitcoin space with other reading, it just probably would make me fall off the boat. There's just
right.
too much information to be consumed constantly that if I was to do anything other, I feel like I'd be left behind within like 3 weeks.
It's like, I'm going to go to law school, but I also think I want to start a research firm while I'm in law school.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just tons of reading. It'd be extremely difficult.
I know.
I'm curious to know, have you ever mined yourself, or like what was it specific? Like, was there anything in particular that kind of got you interested in like Bitcoin mining research when you joined CoinShares?
Well, I mean, my sort of Bitcoin click moment was when I understood the difficulty adjustment algorithm. That was when Bitcoin really, really made sense to me because at first I looked into, how are these things created? And I was like, okay, they're, miners hash. And I was like, well, but what if more and more miners start hashing, won't it just create an unlimited amount? And then the difficulty algorithm was in there and it just hit me like a ton of bricks. So I'd always been interested in it. And, after I finished at my first like Mayfair gig, I worked for an energy shipping brokerage. I sat on the capital services and LNG desk. So I got pretty deep into the energy industry in general, and particularly the oil and gas industry. And renewables was also a really big theme at the time. So, I mean, mining it's just been super fascinating. I've never mined myself, but I was an early investor in, I don't even know what you would call it. It's almost like a proper IPO. It's called ASIC Miner. And it was,
Gotcha.
it was run by this crazy Chinese person called Fried Cat, who may or may have exit scammed later with like 40,000 coins. Some of which are mine.
Well, that's unfortunate, but valuable experience nonetheless, I'm sure.
Right, and then there were these hash like synthetic hash rate derivatives that you could trade. So I've always.
How long ago was that? That's super interesting.
Ago.
I didn't realize that derivatives for hash rate derivatives existed, several years back.
Yeah, I mean they weren't very good, and there weren't very much
concept
volume.
Was there.
The concept was totally there, and the exchange was super shady. And I mean,
like most exchanges in the day, yeah.
Yeah, but this was like back in the day shady. It was shady for the Gox era. So
right, yeah.
So
many of us have fallen into that pitfall there.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So I'd always been super interested in it, and it's something that I've always followed very closely because I find it to be if not underappreciated, then definitely underreported. And I don't think enough people spend enough time. It's one of the hard assurances of the system. And I don't think enough people spend enough time keeping up to speed with what's going on. And, we know that the systemic weaknesses that are the largest for the system come from the mining space. We all know that the system doesn't work very well under 51% attack, for example. So just this is just in the beginning is pretty selfish too. It's just, my own interest in the space is sort of predicated on me feeling good about the decentralization and making sure that everything is going as well as it should.
Right.
So when I came in, we started doing this research report on Bitcoin, and one of the things we were looking into is like the concept of network health. And you could look at the hash rate, but I was never quite happy with that. It's just not enough. So I started looking around for research on the mining network, and there just really wasn't that much. Yeah, it wasn't that much out there at all. And the stuff that you would hear would always just be this like climate FUD. It'd be like, all miners are in China, and all Chinese miners mine on coal, and therefore this is just a ridiculous climate nightmare. So we sort of had to get to the bottom of it ourselves because we couldn't find any other good information on it. So it's just one of those things where, if you want something, you just got to do it.
No, absolutely. I'd be curious to know, and that sounds like that's a pretty big challenge to combat, just the lack of information in the space, and like kind of being the like on the pioneering side of like the fact gathering and data gathering. But like, what would you say have been some of the greatest challenges in the research that you're doing?
Just the fact that it's so underground, mm-hmm. and it's all private, and people are very secretive. And particularly in China, people have traditionally been extremely secretive, and for good reason too. There's been many years of pretty unfavorable treatment from governments, both local and national. So very few miners have been interested in sharing anything about themselves, probably for fear of being found out. It's been a legal gray area in China for many years, and a lot of these miners are sort of skirting around the rules by presenting themselves just as like a generic data center. And it's very relationship driven on the ground. Like, you got to know the right people. You got to make sure that.
I feel like much of China is very relationship driven in general too.
Yeah, very much.
Yeah.
And I've seen mining centers in China where there's literally just giant walls built around the entire facility, such that no one on ground level can actually see in and see what's behind there. So you wouldn't know what's in there. It's
some extra infrastructure costs there.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't have that hard of a time finding information in the West. It's always a challenge with the the smaller and the mid-scale miners. It's just a problem.
Do you think some of the recent policy decisions in China will kind of help, at least in some ways, promote transparency on mining in China?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that might be what they're after too. And then you can speculate on why do they want that. That's
right. Knowledge is power to them.
Exactly.
Knowledge is how people use their money, and you see that in them shutting down like cash payments in certain regions and testing that out to going like all digital. We pay, Alipay.
Yeah, I mean, China is pretty much all. I didn't even touch cash when I was there.
Really?
A couple months back. Yeah,
I did. My taxi drivers did not take cash when I was in Chengdu.
Really?
Mm-mm. Or I mean, so they only took cash. They didn't take any cards or anything like that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I didn't even hold any paper currency my entire time there.
Yeah. I realized though that they don't really use credit cards either, and so that was kind of the problem that I would have run into if I had not gotten cash out of the ATM at the airport. So I had gone to a couple of different like restaurants, and they didn't take cards. So
Yeah, I definitely saw that as an issue. There's a couple of times where I just, you're at like a little, corner store or whatnot, and you just can't get anything
Right. You're like, I
because
just need water.
it's like, yeah, it's like
Yeah,
we
help.
got pay only. I was like, I don't have that,
Right.
and
Yeah.
I don't want it. So sorry. Yeah.
Um, so of all of these misconceptions in the space, I would be curious to know if how you've seen them influence policy decisions. I know like maybe outside of China.
An absolutely exemplary case here is Norway, which it angers me more than anything
I'm
almost.
sure. Yeah, your homeland.
Yeah, exactly. It's so frustrating. So basically what happened there is that there's high taxes on everything in Norway. And the way the government views subsidies sometimes is a subsidy can be the absence of a tax, which,
Interesting.
I mean, it's yeah, let's just use that word. And so what happens if you're an industrial user of electricity is that you get big discounts on the electricity tax, the consumption tax. And so, for example, if you're an aluminum smelter or any type of metallurgic industry or anything that is
One
just
of the most energy intensive globally, right?
yeah, exactly. And in fact, one of the ways that Norway exports its energy is through aluminum. Iceland does the same. It's a
Interesting.
very clever, yeah, it's a very
Yeah,
clever way of doing it because it's an energy sink, right? It's proof of work in a different way. What is it? 1,500. I can't remember if it's kilowatt or megawatt to make like a ton of aluminum.
probably megawatt for a ton.
Probably.
Yeah.
Probably. So it's a good way of exporting your energy through something that can actually be shipped. What happened is that data centers are one of the industrial classes that are exempt from this tax. And what the government decided was that all data centers should be exempt from this tax except cryptocurrency miners. It's almost unbelievably specific and, in my opinion, not very smart. And some of the reasoning for this that was actually quoted on the parliament floor was blog posts about the climate impact of Bitcoin, which is just, you can't even make that up. Like, that is just unbelievably sloppy for like a legislative body.
I will say I
So
find it so odd in the like non-endemic space that the resources and the research that is like most widely trusted is not within the space. Like it's not being produced by a Bitcoin or cryptocurrency like company themselves that is like established themselves as a research institution. It's being produced by like the New York Times or a blog post or maybe like academic researchers who like have really no stake in this space whatsoever, which I think is really detrimental to the space.
And the worst part is that these sort of ground sources, be they blog posts or whatnot, they've snuck into the academic literature and become cited sources within the academic literature, and then those academic papers are then again cited, and then you have this like cycle of papers that are built on quicksand.
Right. Like when did Wikipedia become an acceptable citation?
Right. Well, when did someone's blog post become?
Yeah, in the same vein, anyone
right?
could make that. Anyone could contribute to a blog post.
Yeah, at least Wikipedia is generally pretty solid.
This is true, yeah.
But like blog posts, that is, it's a little out there. So because of that, and because of these errors, and because of lack of good research, miners are now being prejudiced pretty heavily by the government in Norway. And it's a great shame because Norway is 100% renewables driven. We have an incredible amount of capacity for further hydro development. I mean, the whole country is mountain and rain. So, but there's no way of exporting it. So the way it's been exported so far is through aluminum. We have some, obviously grid connections to our neighbors, and then that, kind of trickles down all the way to Europe. There's some cables being laid, so forth and so on. But the country itself is incredibly long. So even just within the country, you have to transport electricity sometimes thousands of kilometers.
And that transmission is incredibly inefficient when you're getting to that kind of distance.
Exactly. So you essentially just end up losing a bunch of it to heat. So it's not economical. So here's a way that Norway could monetize its excess energy resources immediately. And they're doing the opposite. It's infuriating. So this is the prime example, in my opinion, of what can happen in the worst case when regulators or legislators are at the same time probably a little biased going into it, and then either ignorant based on willful ignorance or just pure old lack of knowledge ignorance.
Right. And then they reinforce their biases with information that's supplied by someone who has no stake, experience, or knowledge of the space, and only like of the like high level energy use and consumption. So
yeah, and in certain cases might be predisposed against the network too, and those biases are not even that well hidden on their websites. So it's challenging. Yeah, it's very challenging. So, but I think we're getting somewhere now, though. I mean, we see this research now spreading. It's creeping its way into academia as well. It was one of the main sources by a study that came out of a Danish university a couple months back that used our data to sort of reinforce our conclusions that the climate impact is probably a lot less than what these other academic articles would have you believe, and that we should, take a step back and think about this a little more clearly before we go ahead and do drastic things.
Does CoinShares ever reach out to like regulators or legislators, or like even some of the publications that are publishing these misconceptions?
We haven't reached out to any publications yet. It's a bit of a hard position for us too, because at the end of the day, we're a for-profit company. It's going to be hard for us to claim impartiality. So, I mean, what we would prefer is if people just look at our work and look at our sources, and if they find that to be strong enough for their own work, then just build upon it.
Yeah, I think Canada's like legislative decisions too, most recently around mining, will be really good for the industry at large, but also like kind of serve as a guideline for miners to have a better understanding of like what actions that they can take to reinforce like more favorable legislative decisions, just in the sense of like if they're able to provide like actual benefit, like tangible benefits to the like larger economic system of the country, they're probably far more likely to receive favorable legislation. So
yeah, I mean, it's such a hard issue because it's not a very manpower demanding industry, and a lot of things that governments look at when they want to craft, if not favorable, then at least not disfavorable legislation is, how many jobs are you creating, or what kind of taxes are you paying, and where does the value accrue? So it's a little bit difficult in this case, especially since a lot of the hardware is going to be purchased abroad because we don't have any native ASIC industries in the West. They're all in China or in Korea. So that's where the real jobs are probably. You don't really need that many people to run a mining facility.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, I guess really it'd be like temporary roles on the contracting side for building out the infrastructure.
Yeah. I mean, there's obviously some
right,
stuff.
For sure. But not electricians, like full-time,
you need electricians and maintainers and stuff. And it's all a thing of scale. But if you look at it in terms of like how many jobs are you producing like per megawatt consumed, it's probably one of the lowest around.
Do you think that like that we might see expansion in the near future for like manufacturing in North America?
Well, there are a couple of companies that have stated goals to sort of create a native ASIC industry in the United States from the ground up. So I really hope so. It would be great. And everything that is needed is already there. It's just a matter of intellectual property, of designing good ASICs and finding a place where you can assemble these things cost effectively, which should definitely exist in North America. And then just the reduction in shipping time alone should make
That's
this
what I was
pretty,
thinking too, yeah.
yeah, it should make it pretty competitive. I
Yeah,
mean,
absolutely. And
wait
the,
like
the
2.5
cost of it.
months.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah, and you know, it's just good to have
Decentralization at that level.
correct. If there was ever to be coordinated coordinated campaigns against Bitcoin mining taken by the Chinese government, then you'd want there to be alternatives somewhere else. And it's very positive actually that companies like Canaan have IPO'd in the United States now, meaning that the intellectual property for their ASIC designs are spread out among at least some American investors with legal protection for that. So positive signs, baby steps though, but
that's true. So
it's
I'm
overall
curious.
looking good.
Yeah, slowly but surely things are
Mm-hmm.
are looking like there's a very strong path forward. One of the things that I thought was most notable in the December 2019 report that you published was that 65% of the hash rate is now in China. And I thought that was super interesting. Like even as mining is gaining significant traction in like North America and Central Asia and Norway and Iran, and some of these other areas, I'd be curious to know why, aside from on the manufacturing side and having that like really easy access, and I know that you also mentioned like VIPs who might have, you know, deals set up with those manufacturers to have like the first batch of the equipment that's manufactured. I'd be curious to know what you like, how you think that will look in the coming months. Like, do you think that we're kind of primed for further geographically distributing the hash power in the coming months, or?
Yeah, I think it'll dissipate out to the rest of the world. And it's a few things, right? I mean, among all of the things you mentioned, I think play into it, and then there's shipping time too.
Mm-hmm.
So I think as things progress now, we're going to see the distribution of hash rate, especially if the new gear just spread more and more into Western hands. So I think and hope as well that this is temporary, and I think this is probably something that you're going to see if the manufacturing base remains in China, then I think you're probably going to see an effect like this every time there's an entirely new generation of hardware coming in, and there's a mass change out of hashing equipment across the network. It's just going to fall to the people closest to the production centers first. It's natural.
Right. No, certainly. And I think we see that in a lot of industries as well.
For sure.
I was also curious to know, one of the like kind of excerpts that I pulled from the report was that the lion's share of the newly deployed hardware has been predominantly installed in China. I know that there's still a lot of like existing S9s on the market as well, and this might not be something that you've been able to kind of project, but do you have an idea of like what the ratio of like new hardware to S9 / like older equipment is in China?
No, is the short answer to that. And that's also not something that we've tried to calculate. We might be able to find that out, but we haven't actually tried. We suspect that a bunch of the S9 generation gear that was in China has made its way to more speculative jurisdictions, such as Iran. A bunch of it, we think, has gone to Kazakhstan. We're also wondering if this might be one of the reasons why we haven't observed any migrations of miners inside of China this year, because the gear that you would traditionally move around might have already gone abroad on these like wild goose chases for that, mythical sub-cent electricity. So we know that hundreds of thousands of units have made its way into Iran, and tens of thousands have been confiscated either at the border or by the governments after they've started mining. So I think, but also at the same time, I've seen like Avalon 7 series still running in China. There's definitely places in China where you can run the previous generation hardware profitably. Maybe not now in the dry season. I don't know. I was there in the wet season. I think it's probably drying out more and more. It's especially as we run up to the halving and price keeps price keeps dropping. Depending on where you sit on the cost curve, your S9s are probably going to get booted like relatively soon. See what happens with them. There's a lot of potential use cases that you can have for them. One of the most interesting stuff that I've heard is using them for grid balancing. So
interesting. I would love to hear like your thoughts on that, because I have long been curious, like what happens to old mining hardware that's no longer like efficient enough to make sense. Like it wouldn't be profitable to mine. But I didn't know if it was like sitting in landfills or like storage facilities or like what some like prospects would be for that.
Yeah, I mean, and I feel like this cycle is going to be the first proper big proof of that, if you will.
Certainly, yeah.
Before, I mean, the S9 came out in 2016. It just feels like so long ago, and whatever gear existed before then, it wasn't of the same magnitude as now. Like probably something like 2.5 to 3 million S9s produced, which is a lot. So,
and didn't you estimate like 1.7 are still operational?
Mm-hmm.
It's 1.7 million. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
And it's got a non-trivial breakage rate too. So at some point these things just don't work anymore. And obviously that accelerates as they get older and
depending on the conditions and whether or not they like had proper, ventilation and cooling systems or like filters in the room in which they're being held.
Right. And that is something that happens way more often in the West, where you'll see that facilities are squeaky clean and perfect, and there's no wire spaghetti and cooling and is taken seriously, and climate control and all of that. Whereas in China, sometimes, everything is much more thrown up. The cooling consists of these like drip coolers that just drip water at one side of the facility, and then you have big fans on the other that draw in the now cooler but very moist air full of dust and full of water.
Right. Did you visit the mining facility in Chengdu, outside of Chengdu?
Mm-hmm.
You did? Yeah. I was just so astonished by even just the cord situation there. It was like, how do you even like repair? Like, how do you know what's going on with each like individual rig at this point?
I know, and you can see some of the Western miners sort of just pulled their lip a little bit when they came in there.
It was fascinating, and definitely, I like at first my thought was like, oh, maybe they're like because of seasonality they're like moving around, right? And they just moved in, but I actually think it was towards the end of the period, right? And so they were supposed to be like leaving that facility. They'd spent like their 6 months there during the wet season.
Yeah.
I
Right.
was like, oh. Okay. I thought I had an explanation, but I just don't.
Yeah. So, I mean, now it'll be very fascinating to see what happens to a lot of these units. I think grid balancing is, a potential killer use case for this if it can be done right. We've put so many renewables on the grid in a lot of the Western countries that it's putting immense pressure on the grids because of the natural variance in their production rate. So having these mining units sit near renewables production centers, especially wind farms, and being able to take off like the peak production when the grid either can't handle it or it's just uneconomic, or put in your desired case. And monetize it immediately and sell it to where the demand is. I think that could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's super fascinating. That's something that I haven't yet heard of. But I think that the space is definitely ready for like an influx of like outside experts in terms of like all things energy and like data centers and hardware. I think that is kind of like what's needed for like the next wave of innovation, because we've made it so far already. Like if you look at, where we are in terms of like manufacturing and efficiency, I noticed that in the report you'd said like we'd gone from like an 18-month depreciation schedule to like 30-month, like meaning like hardware efficiency is like steadily increasing so that you're able to make more money for a longer period of time, and it's also more efficient. But that's super interesting. Like we're basically now at the same pace. Like we caught up and innovated far enough to where like we're at the same pace, at least on the chip side, as the rest of the industry. Like we've got chips that they're using in, like iPhones and tablets and whatnot. So we need to think of other areas in which we can innovate and bring in some experts there.
Definitely. And this changes a lot. So when you have, when we're now sort of banging our head up against the innovation barriers that, sometimes are just dictated by the laws of physics. You can only get a mask width to be so narrow before it's on the order of a couple atoms, and then it can't really be any narrower. You can't really have a circuit that's much smaller than a few atoms in width. So when we hit this barrier, be it temporary or not, like we don't know what's going to come in terms of future innovation in chips, but when that happens and chips sort of stagnate in their efficiency gains, then it drastically should lower both the price of chips and it should increase their lifespan. And when you get drastically longer depreciation periods, there are all sorts of business models that open up that have been impossible so far. So for example, solar mining has not really been a thing because if you only have power for half of the day, then you're going to get killed by depreciation.
Right. Yeah. Especially with the ROI on most solar panels installs.
Yeah. So that just has not been a thing. And as soon as you can start depreciating these things over many, many years, I mean, what if we get to depreciation scales, so like 10 years or so, then there's all sorts of things you can do to make money over time. And we can integrate these things much more closely into the energy grid and unlock efficiencies there that we haven't been able to tap so far.
Mm-hmm. And you can playing around too with like different like depreciation schedules for like tax purposes and like looking at investment tax credits and whatnot. So I think that gets really exciting.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And just structuring a lot of these mining as the mining operations get bigger and bigger. I mean, this has been a space that's been sort of dominated by enthusiasts and early sort of hardcore entrepreneurs with big risk appetites and sometimes taking balance sheet risk on holding coins and riding waves and sort of doing everything. As these companies grow, there's probably going to be less and less scope for the management to be able to do that. And you're going to have to sort of structure these things more and more as proper commodities companies. And the proliferation of, proliferation.
It's a tough word.
It is a tough
word.
It
is a tough word. I know what you mean.
The proliferation of derivatives built for and with miners in aim is probably going to make this a lot easier. You need efficient hedging if you're going to be able to run this like modern commodities producers run their operations today.
Mm-hmm. No, certainly. And it's really interesting too. Like, I think what you said about like these operations, like really honing in and like doubling down and focusing on like one thing rather than trying to do like 20 different things in the space, because they're excited about all of them. And like in a way, I feel like that was, several years ago, that was kind of their way of like hedging against risks and trying to have exposure to lots of different like potential like success areas in the market. Now they're able to double down, but it's also interesting because you look at like the cost of operations. Going from GPUs to ASICs was huge, right? But like we're also looking at like significantly higher capital needs just for like your initial overhead costs, right? So we need to find better ways to finance these operations if we want to continue expanding the operations, and also for the purposes of like geographical distribution. So then I think we start looking at like kind of straying away from the traditional like equity model in the space to the more industry standard within infrastructure projects to debt, like back levered debt.
Completely agree. And this is one of the things that make me optimistic on behalf of Western mining, is that the efficiency of Western capital markets is probably going to come in and have an effect at some point. Once this industry has matured past a certain point where it's not viewed as so extremely risky in the eyes of investors, the power of Western capital markets are probably going to lower investment cost for Western miners in particular.
Yeah.
This is always going to be a benefit for anyone conducting business in jurisdictions where there's fundamentally a rule of law and where you can have some certainty that your property will not be confiscated or be subject to arbitrary bans on part of some authoritarian entity. So there's definitely a lot of efficiency to be unlocked with the financialization of mining capital.
Yeah, especially when non-endemic Western investors look at your balance sheet and they see oh, look at this prime real estate, look at this mix of renewables that you've got going on, and they see other value adds and value propositions for what you have going on in your project aside from mining, and mining is your way to make what you're doing profitable and make money, then sure, I think that the risk appetite is definitely there.
Yeah, it's just a matter of time, in my opinion, as is a lot in this industry. We see this here on the investment side too, is that a lot of people are of the opinion that if this just goes on for long enough and it keeps ticking and it keeps working and it's just still there, at some point it just becomes a part of the norm. And at that point, I think we're going to be able to unlock quite a lot of investment capital.
No, I totally agree on that. Also, from the report, I thought, you have continued to, in these reports, make a really important distinction between the all-in ROI break-even level and the cash cost break-even level. Notably that miners are going to go offline when their operating expenditures exceed income, and then mining gear becomes cash flow negative. So that's not at the point of negative ROI. But I would love for you to elaborate a little bit on this and kind of where these foundings are based and kind of how you're reaching these numbers.
Yeah, so this is something that I explored in depth in a blog post that I did, I think about a year ago. And the context of this was we saw the first sort of large-scale mining capitulations in the post-industrial era of mining. And we were sort of talking about this mining death spiral narrative and all of this, and I just hadn't seen a big comprehensive take on this. People had different ways of calculating marginal creation cost, and then they would confuse the marginal creation cost with the capitulation cost or the capitulation level. And I just felt that it was important to make a distinction between the two, because you can be ROI negative but cash flow positive, and this is just very common in all commodities producing industries, especially the ones that are very front loaded with capex, like mining or oil production, shipping, you name it. You have to pay extremely large sums upfront, and then you spend the lifetime of the asset trying to make back your investment cost plus your capital cost, and then only once you surpass that do you make a positive return on your investment, which means that your capital is preserved and you'll be able to reinvest down the line. But that is not what determines when miners shut their gear down, because say that you've built an oil rig that will give you a positive return on investment if oil is above $100 a barrel for, say, 30 years. You're not going to stop producing oil even if the production cost, the sales cost falls below $100 a barrel. You're only going to stop production when the sales cost per barrel is, the sales price is lower than the cost that you have ongoing for taking the oil out of the ground. So long as you're at all cash flow positive, you will continue to operate in the hope that at least the cash that you're bringing in is helping towards paying back the investment cost you had initially. So miners won't shut their gear down until keeping the miner on is actually bleeding cash. That's when the shut-off cost comes.
Right.
So I just thought it was important to make sure that everybody understood the distinguishing difference between the two numbers. So it is important that the mining industry as a whole is ROI positive, and it will be. I mean, it's self-regulating. So the miners that are not ROI positive over time will have their capital destroyed, and they won't be able to reinvest. But it's not. We won't see capitulations until the cash flow break even is below the price. That's when miners get plugged out, because you are effectively losing money. You're losing cash. You're bleeding cash just by having the units turned on.
Right. Like when your operating costs, like let's just say for a standard small business, like your rent and the cost of employees and producing your product are higher than the cost at which you can sell your product and the demand for your product. Like certainly, like it doesn't make sense. Like you've got a business model and you've got, despite the fact you have like upfront investments and upfront capital poured into this business, like you're continuing to lose money as you go. So there's not a clear path forward to profitability, which in which case, right, it just doesn't make sense to continue operating.
Right. And especially when your operation is not debt financed. If it is debt financed, then this changes the calculation a bit, because then your upfront cost is borne by someone else and your ongoing cost includes paying back your debt plus interest. And
right.
That can actually cause you to have to shut down your operation and become insolvent at a much earlier point. But debt financing, especially on stringent commercial terms, is just not something that we've seen be very common in this industry. It's very often private equity done up front, and it makes you less sensitive to these things. And your cash flow break even is essentially your electricity cost and your overhead, and even overhead can probably be deferred for like a certain amount of time. So
right. That's a really good point, because like when you think about bringing debt into the industry and like, how it could really help push expansion forward, at the same time, like we are in need of much greater stability in the space before I think that we're able to bring, before debt becomes an option.
Right. And there just needs to be more information out there too. I mean, before any regular institution is probably going to be comfortable debt financing this, they got to know with at least some certainty, like where on the cost curve does this operation sit, and what are the risks of drastically cheaper electricity popping up somewhere else, and all of a sudden you get booted to the high end of the cost curve. It's a pretty difficult risk management calculation to do for
so
debt
many
issuers at this point. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's hard. And then this part of what we're trying to do here is just increase the visibility on the space as a whole, so that there's at least some, if some pretty consistent and continuous information outputs that you can look to sort of build your picture of where you need to look at risks.
So I'm curious to know of some of the numbers that you mentioned, like when so you say that the all-in ROI break-even is 6,100 in this report, roughly, and then that the like more or less the level at which we would reach minor capitulation would be somewhere below the $2,500 mark, right?
Yeah. So the cash flow break even. So the $2,500 mark, that would be for like a brand new unit.
Okay,
so
gotcha.
If you look at this is the reason why we put this in table form, right? Because just calling out one number here is not that useful, because it's such a wide market and conditions are so different that I always find it better to present the results in such a way that you can look at a table and find the cross point between either an operation that you're looking into, or maybe if you don't agree with our assumptions. So our assumptions now is that the center level for mining electricity costs is around 4 cents, but I know there's disagreement on that. Other people think it's 5, other people think it's 6. And then there's the question of depreciation schedule. If you're looking at like a certain mining operation, you might know that they have only the, brand spankingest new gear, and they can probably depreciate this over at least 4 years. Then you'd go all the way to the left of the table. Then you know that they're mining at 3 cents. And you also happen to know that they paid 25% less than the average miner for their CapEx. Then you select your right table, then you go to the right square in the table, and you find that their cost would be 4,000 for current ROI break-even levels. And so for cash flow, there's no depreciation schedule involved, right? Mm-hmm. What we have there is that we do the electricity OPEX against the overhead, the additional cooling and other OPEX. So say that you know that someone is mining on 3 cents and their overhead is about 10%, then you can look in the table and you can see that their cash flow break-even level is likely around 2,800. And again, the issue here is that is market average gear. And right now there's a bit of a bifurcation between the two generations of gear, right? So our average sits right in the middle, which is, kind of neither not one nor the other, which is why that's why in the key takeaways, I included some more back of the envelope calculations for cash flow break-evens for newer generation and older generation, just to show that there's a bit of a difference. So, the 16 nanometer generation would capitulate, was it around 5.5 at 4 cents? So
good memory.
Yeah, at even higher levels at 5 and 6 cents. So it shows that, if you're running those units, then you're either running them on very cheap electricity, or they're about to be obsolete. So, reading through the results in the table form gives you a bit of an interesting insight to how the conditions being different between different miners can result in completely different both ROI break-even levels and cash flow break-even levels.
So I'm also curious to know, kind of like thinking about older models and profitability, and like some of them potentially being forced to go offline after the halving and just, through these swings and lower rewards. What, if you were thinking about like the increase in the hash rate, right? So like we went from, it increased like 90%, I believe. And then you also look at like where the majority of the concentration of where your basis was for the majority of this new hash rate that was brought onto the network was in China, right? So I'm curious to know if we think about it that way and kind of like where that distribution was, and assuming that the majority of that hash rate was brought on from new equipment, how do you think the halving is going to affect the hash rate? Like just knowing that some of these older machines are going to be going offline. We also, I think, have kind of that strong hedge there in China, having all this new hash rate brought on from new equipment.
Yeah. The question of impact from the halving is it's always completely muddled by the price. You got to make a price prediction,
right?
So if the price stays exactly where it is today, you could expect a 50% drawdown in the hash rate. Assuming that the network is currently mining right at the margin, which they probably are. So all things being equal, the halving could boot off, almost all of the previous generation hardware, except those few cases where you're mining at, 1 point something cents. But if the price recovers, all it takes is doubling of the price, and then conditions are exactly as they were before. So it's really, really hard to make predictions without having to bring out your price crystal ball, which is always a bit of a hornet's nest.
I'm not really a big fan of price predictions in general.
Yeah.
Like I think within a $20,000 window, maybe, but outside of that, I just think that, it's
it's guesswork, right? So You would think that all things else being equal, a reduction in supply of 50% overnight, if demand stays the same, should have a positive impact on the price as a whole. But then you got to look at persistent mining selling pressure in the context of old school, holder selling pressure, which could dwarf that at least over certain stretches of time. So it becomes a very, very complex equation.
No, it certainly does. And I think that's one of the difficulties of this space is that there is just the future is one large unknown in many cases. Like even if you believe in Bitcoin and it's like long-term sustainability, 5 months down the road, there could be factors which nobody in the space could have forecasted that kind of just really shake things up. So
definitely. Yeah. But the positive thing is that what we do know is that the miners seem to have very strong faith in this, and you don't even have to consider their words or opinion or anything. You can just look at their actions, and their actions show that they've invested billions of dollars into the network on the belief that this is going to remain a strong cash generating business for the foreseeable future, at least for several years coming, or they won't make their investment back on this current generation of gear.
No, absolutely. I think that speaks really, really strongly and positively for the space at large as well. Yeah. I would be remiss not to at least briefly touch on energy mix and consumption in Bitcoin mining, just because you've been one of the pioneers helping to shed light on these misconceptions. I would be curious to just hear a little bit more, and I know I've definitely seen some fantastic presentations from you about some of the misconceptions specifically in China and at large. And I think one of the important clarifying clarifications that you've made is that miners are relying on renewables because these incentives align, right? The renewable energy tends to be stranded in many cases, like you mentioned in the case of Norway, and that tends to make it significantly cheaper because there is really no option to transmit it super long distances. I would be curious to hear what some of the what these findings, how they might impact or how you believe that they'll impact accelerating larger renewables penetration globally, and then kind of focusing in a little bit on China. I know that China is making a huge push towards renewables, and I think they're leading us in terms of renewable energy that they're adding to the grid.
Yeah, I think this could have a very significant impact on helping the profitability of renewables projects. As we've mentioned a lot of times, renewables have this very peculiar drawback in that they kind of have to be built where the natural resource is. That's the extremely flexible and beneficial thing about fossil fuels, is that you can transport them from A to B and then generate the energy on the spot. And during transport, they don't lose any of their energetic content. Whereas if you transport electricity across a grid, you do lose a lot of the content. So being able to now focus more on where can we get the most electricity for our money, if you will, and being able to build renewables projects where the wind blows the strongest or where the biggest river is, and having this sort of extremely mobile cornerstone industrial demand, being able to follow it wherever it goes and take off a bunch of the production up to a certain price level is a pretty interesting new development. So Bitcoin essentially becomes an energy consumer of global last resort. It will buy any energy below a certain price. That is pretty cool. So and again, this comes back to what we were saying earlier, if this space just gets to mature enough and get to a point where people are more comfortable with it, what we hope to see is using mining as an integral part of the financing models of a lot of these projects. There are some pioneer projects that are looking into this already, and I always talk about Soluna as an example. Hopefully they get off the ground at some point. But they've pinpointed this extremely windy spot on the western coast of Africa, where you can get over twice the production efficiency of the average global windmill. And the big question is offtake. So you have this nearby town that is still small. Relies on diesel generation, and electricity cost is extremely high. But going in there and building this multi-gigawatt wind park is total overkill for the city. So you need someone to take off the electricity while either the city grows or industry, like traditional industry, moves in. And the natural immediate off-taker for that are Bitcoin miners, who can pretty much show up immediately. Don't need much infrastructure other than an internet connection and either a road or some way to get the miners there. And this type of mining as an integral part of the financing model could really help unlock a lot of renewables projects that are currently deemed uneconomical due to distance to demand centers or just grid connections that would be too expensive to justify the investment, at least under current legacy conditions. So this is what we're hoping to see. We don't know if that's going to materialize, obviously, but we're seeing sort of a budding interest in this type of financing models. I mean, you have projects in Texas now that are building wind farms using miners as immediate off-takers. So we're seeing some budding signs. We don't want to get too caught up in the optimism, but it could really become an important puzzle piece in the renewables development of the future. Not to mention the grid integration, which is extremely important when considering renewables being added to grids that we've built for constant or steady state electricity production, and the grids are fine-tuned to be able to handle the maximum offtake that our society demands. And herein comes renewables with their pretty inconsistent production cycle. Sometimes the wind is blowing really hard or the sun is really roasting everything, and then our grids essentially can't handle this because we have some of these other power plants that are constantly running, like our nuclear plants that can't even be shut off on a time frame less than weeks. So all of a sudden we have this challenge where we either have to spend a ton of money building a grid that has a large excess capacity to be able to take these like peaks in production, which is a very expensive thing, and all of a sudden the electricity cost for the end consumer is bumped up substantially, and it makes renewables perversely unpopular. We're seeing this in Denmark and in Germany in particular, where you've had huge wind developments happen, and you have conditions sometimes where the wind generation is essentially producing more electricity than the grid can handle, and people are paid to take it off their hands. So being able to integrate mining into this to sit and selectively be able to take this load off of the grid whenever production is the highest, which is also when price is the lowest, and monetize it immediately, that's a huge opportunity. So
that's
it's a space to watch.
Super interesting. Like, even if, it would probably there would be a lot of factors going into this for it to be profitable, but like even, the shift in operational hours of like if there's solely operational overnight, right? Like when there's like the cost is significantly lower. I think that could be an interesting use case as well. But
yeah,
definitely that would be
definitely.
probably closer to cities.
And it comes back to what we were discussing earlier in stretching the depreciation schedule for the hardware. So if you can either get, or essentially lowering the ongoing capex cost of the production cost, like the capex factor of the
Right.
production cost. If that is as low at, if you can minimize that, then you enable all of these new interesting business models.
Certainly. I had a friend who he's a miner in Texas, actually. He was visiting earlier this week. And so they actually built their own grid for that very reason. Like it just made more sense for them to build out their own grid. And he's been telling me that they're adding an additional 8 gigawatts of wind energy to the grid, despite the fact that there is mostly nowhere for it to go, but it's still profitable. So people still have incentives to create these massive wind farms. And they even have the turbines are built higher than the standard. I think it's like 140 foot tall wind turbines, so that they can access higher wind speeds at higher altitudes and in the upper atmosphere. So I just find it fascinating because when you think about that and like, well, that's significantly more production. That's a ton of energy, 8 gigawatts.
Yeah, that's more than the entire network.
Right. Yeah. It's just insane. So I'm very curious to see what will happen with that energy in the next 2 years. So
you gotta love Texas, though.
Right, man. I feel like at some point they're just going to be their own nation over there. They have their own way of doing things.
They arguably should, and they have their own grid too, actually, in the United States.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
one out of 4 grids is the Texas grid. So.
Yep.
Yeah, but I mean, that's kind of what happens when you just let business do what business wants to do. You get this massive investment, and it's driving down electricity costs for everyone, which increases prosperity. Like, what's not to like about it?
Absolutely. I've like long been a believer that if we're going to have factories in North America and they happen to be in the United States, that they'll be along the border. Taking advantage of the really nice tax advantages that we've got and still have, even with the new NATO or the new NAFTA.
Yeah, I haven't had the chance to look into the details of the new NAFTA. So
not much change, really only mostly affects automobile industry. So it's interesting though.
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, electricity cost is key.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I think the people that see that are really pushing towards renewables and really lowering that cost, which is interesting because I don't think that like standard infrastructure industries, like maybe it's because they found ways to be profitable and to like finance it and have depreciation, like significantly longer depreciation schedules, that they're not, at least in my opinion, they don't seem to be as concerned about the cost of electricity, at least in the way that miners are like scurrying to get like sub 1 cent and like really hustling to make that happen. I haven't really seen that in the traditional infrastructure space.
Yeah, I mean, if you have a business model that functions and you've hedged your exposure to whatever risks you might have, and you know that any competition coming in would require a huge investment that is probably not forthcoming unless there's a big increase in market demand, then yeah, I mean, why do you care?
No, totally. Well, do you have any parting thoughts that you would like to share, perhaps from the new report?
I think we've covered most of it, to be honest. So I really appreciate you having me on.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you joining me today, especially with you towards the tail end of your illness, and heading into the holidays as well. Chris, where can we find you and CoinShares on social media and on the internet?
You can find us on Medium, under CoinShares, and me personally, just under Chris Bendiksen. And you can find us on Twitter under @CoinSharesCo, or my personal Twitter, which is @C_Bendiksen.
Awesome. And you can find me on Twitter at Bitcoin Casts, and follow the show at What's Happening. And of course, be sure to subscribe to What's Happening and stay up to date with the latest mining podcasts. Chris, thanks once again for joining me. I really appreciate it, and really excited to get this episode out to the public.
All right, my pleasure.
Thanks. Thanks to all my listeners out there for tuning in to today's episode of What's Happening. The What's Happening podcast is a BTC Media produced podcast on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network. It was produced and edited by Christian Corollas. You can find more podcasts covering Bitcoin on the Let's Talk Bitcoin network and can follow them on Twitter at the LTB network for all of the latest episodes. The following content is for informational purposes only. You should not construe any such information or other material as legal, tax, investment, financial, or other advice. Nothing contained in this presentation constitutes a solicitation, recommendation, endorsement, or offer by BTC Media, the Let's Talk Bitcoin network, or any third-party service provider to buy or sell any securities or other financial instruments.